Justin ran this idea by me about 6 or 7 months ago, and I thought, you know, I really would like to come to Balmullet to speak, and the theme that we kind of came up between us was landscape, and the idea of a gendered landscape. And I found the idea of landscape for myself to be particularly fruitful because my work, the 5 books I've written, are peculiarly indebted to the landscape of Mayo. Every time I take up my pen and start to write novels, prose, or anything, there's this pull in its steering that always brings me back to the landscape of Mayo. I didn't consciously, when I started as a writer, I didn't consciously say, Jesus, what's badly needed now is 4 or 5 books about Mayo. That wasn't what I thought of. It's just, that was the gravity that was in my pen. That was the pull that was in my pen. So when Justin put this proposition to me, I said, you know, I would like to actually inquire into that a small bit and that, or at least tell the story of it and that. And then did it under this idea of Toras Naman. And the more I inquired into it and that, the more I found that, and I was running this by Maeve last night, and she was listening to me going on, and she shook her head after a couple of minutes, and she says, "You're going up there now doing this, talking to all these women on Toras Naman, and here you are talking about all this masculine stuff and that." She says, "Is that the way it's going to be?" And I said, "Well, actually, yes, because that's the story, but also no, because there's kind of a twist in the tail at the end of it." So I'm going to sort of tell you the story of my kind of involvement and how I derived what passes for my inspiration from the landscape in which I was. And I'm going to tell it as a story about, more or less about myself. I was born, like many another Mayo man, I was born in London. I was born 53 years ago. And my mum is from Dahoma, out the road here, and my father's from Louisburg. I was corrected about that. I was corrected about that in London once and that. My father's from Louisburg though. And I've no memories really of London, because I was at about the age of 4, 3.5, 4, and that. We came back to, my father was pretty much, you know from this, my father was a navvy, and my mother was a tatty hawker, and she worked in hospitals and places like that, so very recognizable to people from around there. So one of the things we did as when they were a young couple, they came home in the summer, and we stayed with our grandparents, what were my grandparents, up in Balmullet, up in Dahoma. And that was, I don't know if you know Dahoma, but it's about as flat as you can, as Ireland gets really in many ways. And once you go back behind Bangor, it just flattens out, and there's no hills, very few, and there's no broadleaf trees, and it's kind of wide open and that. And so I lived back, came home on holiday one summer, and at about the age of about 4, I said to my mother and father, I says, "I'm grand here, you go back to London. I'll stay here with Granny and Grandad, I'll be grand." And they said, "Sound. If you're they said, if you're happy there, well, we're happy." And now I find that absolutely amazing, because I have a child, you know, like so many other things in my life, I arrived late to so many things in my life, and one of them is parenthood. I have a child who's exactly this age now, he's just 4.5. And I was that age when I said goodbye to my mother and father. So I lived there for about over 2 years in that, with them. And that landscape and that farm and that landscape, as I grew older and as I look back on it, it became such an incredible kind of a resource, imaginative resource and wellspring for so many things that happened that I wrote about, and particularly in Solar Bones. It became a very big part of what energized Solar Bones. But the farm, I remembered, I was very happy there as a child. I was. This sounds odd to the generation, the generations of kids growing up now, but I was very happy there. I was very lucky. I understood myself to be completely in my extended family. I understood that my grandparents were my family, and that my uncles who were coming and going, that they too were my family. And it was a very feminine household. It was a really big family. There's 15 or 16 kids in it and that, and aunts and uncles. But there was loads of aunts and uncles coming and going and that. So it was a really privileged place to grow up in. A small farm, and it was a farm that I understood to be, when I look back on now, it was a farm like every other farm in the village. But when I look back now and that, I see that it was a farm that was powered by horse and cart and that. Horse and cart, and I used to see my grandfather and my uncle going out into the field with a plough and a harrow and a scuffler. And when I came of age, years later, when I was studying the history of technology, I realized that these machines that I'd seen my father and that I'd seen my uncles and that working with, that they hadn't evolved since the Middle Ages. That this is effectively a farm that was in some ways, it was still back in the Middle Ages. It wasn't the only farm. Every other farm along Dahoma and Canrava and all over the western seaboard was powered by horse and cart, by these machines that hadn't developed since the medieval period. And one of the things that I found amazing about that is that my uncle, who in his late teens and early 20s, I would have seen him as horse and cart. In the space of a lifetime, in the space of about 50 years, to plough this land, one of the spaces I've seen, one of the things that I always think is staggering is that 40 or 50 years later, he had evolved from a horse and cart to a tractor that had GPS on it. So think about that as an imaginative leap in one man's life and that. I find that incredible. I find that, literally going from a horse and cart to a digital interstellar technology and that, to satellites. That's an incredible leap in that. But one of the landscapes I remember from that time on that farm was, one of the things I remembered about that was that women did the work of two people. They did a woman's work in the home, and they did a man's work in the field as well. And so it was working side by side with women was something that was a pretty unique experience, was unique to that place. One of the places I remember being particularly feminized for some reason or other were hayfields. Hayfields were in my imagination and in my memory, and this is one of the things about this talk, is that this is why I brought no visuals with me, because I'm speaking as I remember it, and I'm speaking of memory and imagination and that. And in my memory and my imagination, hayfields were incredibly well-lit places, incredibly bright places where you got burned as a child, and where you were putting up pike and hay, but also where women came out and worked and that. And this was, and they did so in bogs as well, and they did so and they were always around the dairies and everything like that. But they worked in, I always remember them specifically in hayfields. I know hayfields clean work, and it was kind of light, not so light, but kind of light in that. So that lightedness, that flat landscape of Dahoma, big huge sky overhead, the sea at the bottom of the land, this house with all these men and women in it and that, formed a particular backdrop. It was the first kind of when I cast myself back in memory, it's the first topography, it's the first landscape that I remember in that. And the next landscape that I remember is a place that I've never been to, and that I plan to go to it someday, but I've never been to it, and it was hugely important. My father was a great reader, and one of the things he used to like so many men of his generation, one of the things he read was the Westerns of Louis L'Amour. You all know him, yeah? The Westerns of Louis L'Amour. And Louis L'Amour, very early in my life, at the age of 6 or 7, I read all these Westerns that he had. And he was quite formulaic, and there was a time in my life when I turned against him because he was formulaic, and now there's a time in my life when I turn back to him because I saw just how good that formula was and that. And but one of the formulas, one of the places that he had was that he used to cite his Westerns in the Mojave Desert. And they were always about a man has to take charge of a woman and get her across the desert, and he's menaced by Indians and weather and the climate and everything like that. And the Mojave Desert, Louis L'Amour was always proud of his knowledge of the Mojave Desert, and it spread out in front of my imagination, blindingly white, massive skies overhead, massive falls in temperature at night, and menaced by snake and Indians and all kinds of things like that. And there was a time in my life when I was more familiar with the Mojave Desert than I was with Mayo or any other part of the world in that. And I always reckoned that if I'd been dropped there, that I'd be able to, I'd know how to treat a snake wound and all that thing. Just from the reading of these books and that. It was so vivid to me. At about this time we moved up to Louisburg, to my father's place. And it was then came into the second of only 4 or 5 landscapes that kind of mean so much to me, and that have governed my work and affected it and inflected it. It's a small village called Pulblas. It's called Pulblas. It's a green hole, and you have to go on a kind of a hook around the land to come into it. And it's a small village that's thrown down behind hills, and the land runs down to the sea, and you look across at Achill and Mulranny and Clare Island up the coast. And you come in the road, and the road stops. That's it. That's the end of the world. You have to turn around and go back out, because the road goes no further. His joke he used to make of it was that it was either the first place God made and he didn't know what he was doing, or it was the last place God made. He was just tired and fed up and just threw whatever material was at hand down behind this hill and that. And if you see it, in my imagination, and it was the first landscape really that dominated one of my books, and it dominated this book. It dominated Crow's Requiem, and I saw it as a kind of a purgatorial kingdom. For one reason was that with the hills at the back, the sun rises up very late in the year, and with Clare Island being positioned where it is, and Clare Island quite high, it goes down actually quite quickly in the evening as well. So that the lighted day is quite remarkably shorter in Pulblas than it is anywhere else. And it's also, it gives the impression of being much more actually out of the way than it is, because it's so enclosed behind these hills and that. It gives the impression that it's actually quite far from the rest of civilization. But I use that landscape. It formed a big part of my work in Crow's Requiem when I was doing it. So those are the first kind of 3 or 4 landscapes that I encountered, and they formed an awful lot of my there was Dahoma, there was the Mojave Desert, and there was Pulblas. And then from Pulblas, we used to go in the car, and we used to journey up to Dahoma on the summer. Well, about 2.5 hours at the time. You do now in 2 hours because the world is smaller somehow on that. But it was 2.5 hours, and between me, you know, you'd have to stop the car every 4 or 5 miles because I was a great puker as a child and that. And kids did that back then. They don't seem to do it so much now, but they did that back then. And I came into, one of the places that to this day is hugely significant to me is Ballycroy. Coming down through Ballycroy. Ballycroy, back in those days, it's slightly changed now because there's conifers in it and plantations and everything. But back in the day, when I was a kid, it was stripped of everything. And the only thing that was there was Bordnamona had cut turf on it and that. And it was absolutely immense. It used to spread way out to the horizon. And it used to spread way off to the left and way off to the right. And our little car felt so small going through this land and going through this over this terrain. And I gradually came to the realization that this is my Mojave Desert. This was my kind of treacherous, anything could happen going across there. And that image of this place as being dangerous and that was cemented for me by one time we passed a car that had over the weekend, this is before drink driving laws and that, it passed a car every time, you know, you wake up on a Monday morning and there would always be cars in the ditch. That. And well, it was the truth. You know, panel beaters will tell you that drink driving laws put an end to a whole generation of panel beaters and that. But he was when you one of the things we were driving along and sure enough there was a car in the side of the ditch, and I said to my dad as we were driving along, I said to him, "Geez, what happened to that?" And he'd said, without dropping a beat, he'd said that was Indians. He said, that was Indians. And I ran with that. That was good enough for me. I thought, geez, yeah, you could get ambushed around here awful badly. And that formed, this was my it became for me a kind of a, I stopped in it, I remember stopping a couple of times in Cleary's and having a few pints, because that's what you did when you're driving big long journeys, and in those days and that you had to stop and that. And I remember it being so wild. Is Cleary's gone now? Did someone tell me it's closed? Yeah. Someone told me it's closed, yeah. But the expanse of it, and I've relations there back in Durrell. I've never been back to it, but I'm told that it's a wild place and everything like that. And this I just try to impress upon you just the sense of expanse and immensity that this was to a child on that. And I actually got something. Actually, I came from Castlebar to here. I came down through Ballycorrick, and there's something of it today. Just today looked one of those big days. And I came over and I go, Jesus, I remember this. This is huge. And you could talk about Connemara and you talk about Donegal and this, that, and the next thing and that. But I've always maintained that the real Wild West was north of Newport and west of Crossmolina and that. And so that was a landscape that particularly enamored me and enthused me and kind of energized my work. And the last one then was my home place in Louisburg. And it seems to me that my little town and the vantage point where our particular house is above the town, and it looks down slightly a little bit. It's kind of elevated a little bit, and it looks down over the village and that. And again, that seems to be one of the places where my pen gravitates to whenever I start writing and that. I consider myself actually to be very, very lucky in this, that I don't have to think about this, that this is, and I wonder if there's any kind of time in which this vein is going to exhaust itself. I don't know. We'll see. So far it hasn't happened. I've heard of Pat McCabe talking about how he says, I've done Clonus, that's it. You know, I've written 6 or 7 books, move on. I don't know will that happen. Maybe it will, or maybe it'll, just Louisburgh will expand to take over the whole world or something like that. The whole world will become Louisburgh or something like that. But those are the landscapes that I worked with in my work, and you can see that they're pretty. They're known to you. They're within reach of us. I didn't have to reach far for them, and I've often wondered why I'm so given to them. And one of the reasons is because this is something that I do know. I do know these landscapes, and I have this kind of familial and emotional connectedness to them and that. And but it's also because the type of work that I do, I see it as conjectural and speculative. I see what I do as, although I see myself as a realist writer, I see myself as conjectural and speculative and that. But in order to be conjectural and speculative, you must know something about where you're speculating and being conjectural from. And it's about, the landscape seems to be, for me, the Mayo landscape seems to be the thing of which I'm fairly assured of. And once I have these hills and these bogs and these other things, once I have these things under my feet, then I don't have any difficulty with ghosts. I don't have any difficulty with putting penal experiments into the Killary Harbour. I don't have any difficulty with robots or spaceships or anything like that. Once I have this ground beneath my feet, anchor, ballast, certainty, foundation. Once I have this under my feet, then anything can happen and that. And instead of it being actually a kind of something that limits me, I've always seen it as something as powerfully enabling. I see it not just as the ground out of which I write, but actually the fount out of which I write as well. So you'll have seen from all of that anyways that, by the way, actually I come here in a spirit of inquiry, because a couple of the things that I'm going to say from now on, I really don't know what I'm talking about, and I'd be really interested in seeing what you think of them and that. But one of the things, so there you have it. And this is the thing. This is the idea that I was running by Maeve last night, and she says, I don't know about that. She says, you're talking about small farmers, male farmers that make up, bachelor farmers that make up notes from McCormack, more farmers there, and a male engineer here, and you were going up talking to these women and that. She said, I don't know. And it's something I've often thought about, is why my own work is so governed by the masculine and that, and governed by an inquiry into the masculine. And one obvious reason was the very sudden death of my father. My father died when I was 18, and he was in his late 40s, and mid to late 40s, and he died in an incident that actually no one would. He died in a sort of an incident that, not an incident, but in kind of circumstances that a fiction writer wouldn't even chance himself. He went out one night. He was out one night he was out in Gaffney's, and the man beside him dropped dead of a heart attack. And he went to his funeral a couple of nights later, and he went and he had 2 pints, and he came home, and he died of a heart attack in the bed. And so it's as if the death of my father gave me a theme. And one of the themes that recurs in my work is fathers. That doesn't separate me from any other male Irish writers. We tend to talk about fathers, but my own fathers differ in this, in that they're decent and good men, and that they seem to want the best for their loved ones and everyone like that. So, as it happens, there aren't that many women in my books. The women that are in my books are actually mothers and daughters whom seem to be so well established in the books that I don't even have to write about them in many ways. That they're kind of peripheral, but they're strong. There's the woman next door in this novel, who who I think is the strongest character in the book, and that she's only in it for 8 or 10 pages or something like that. There is a love interest in this one, in Crow's Requiem. This is the book that people. This is the book that's the kind of cuckoo in my nest. This book here. This is the book that divided the world when I published it. Some people thought it's brilliant. Other people won't acknowledge it at all. There are people in my own family who won't acknowledge it, and that. And this is and in Solar Bones there are two women, a mother and a daughter, and Marcus the engineer, this man who has put the web of reason on this landscape out there, and that, who has surveyed it and who has built on it and everything like that. The people he really admires in his life are the women in his life, because they just seem to be completely at home in the world in a way that he's not quite at home in it at all. He's so struck by shock and wonderment frequently that he can hardly put one foot in front of the other in that. But when I was laterally, it seems to me that so Maeve was saying, she says, you're going up now talking about engineers and cowboys and small farmers and that. And I said, yeah, but I says, there's been a twist in my work of late, and I said, it's fairly like me that I would come to certain things late in my life. Everything I do, I come to it late in life, and that, marriage and parenthood and all that kind of thing, and intellectually it takes me a long time to get around to things and that. But the last two stories that I've written, the last two stories I've written with no bidding and completely out of the blue and that have female central characters, and they have an explicit relationship with landscape, and an explicit relationship with the landscape of Mayo as well. One of my characters, and it's called Mass for Four Voices, and it's a story about this woman. She's a sculptor, and in Ballycroy National Park, she's a cloud sculptor. One of my projects as a writer is one of the projects I have as a writer is I write whatever books come to me and that. But a conscious, deliberate project I have is to see Mayo as a science fiction. Is it possible to write a science fiction out of Mayo? Can it be done? Is there a future? Do we have a future in that? What?
You can.
Thank you. Well, that's what I'm trying. And this is one person. This sculptor has come to me, and she's a cloud sculptor, and she sculpts a cloud in the national park in Ballycroy, and people come to see this cloud, and this cloud becomes a religious experience, and it becomes a religious experience, and it becomes almost a new way of worship, and it's kind of gently forgotten but not forgotten, and it seems to be sort of a gentle kind of renewal. And this woman has access to all sorts of technology and all sorts of sensibility, what Lilish was talking about there, kind of a spiritual sensibility on that. And then there's my other story, second one, the one I've just finished, is a story about, and this is a story about, set in Louisburg, and I don't know if you know Louisburg. Louisburg is built on a delta. The Bonown River flows out on that, and it has flattened all the land around it and that. And it strikes me as, the more I was looking at it, it strikes me as peculiarly susceptible to flooding. If the world keeps going the way we're told the world is going, it strikes me as particularly susceptible to flooding and that. And this woman in my book she works for an insurance company. She works for a reinsurance company, and reinsurance companies insure insurance companies. They're absolutely massive, and they're so big that they actually can change government policy and that. But she works as an actuary for a reinsurance company, and she shows them the future. She shows them by way of a hologram